There we go. Welcome to Sherwood Uniting Church this morning for our Good Friday service and reflection. Our service this morning is going to have a fairly simple format of readings and some reflections and songs. We'll be working our way through the story of Jesus' crucifixion as told in the Gospel of Luke. But to begin with, some words from the prophet Isaiah, somewhere between 600 and 800 years before Jesus of Nazareth was even born. Who has believed what we've heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? But he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through this knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured himself out to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Our first song this morning will be Lead Me to the Cross.
Jesus before Pilate. Then the assembly arose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." They were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean, and when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Jesus is sentenced to death. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over to them as they wished.
crucifixion of Jesus. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him and saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
It was now about noon, and darkness had come over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." When all the crowds who had gathered there for the spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home eating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Now there was a good and righteous man named Joseph, who, though a member of the council, had not agreed to their plan and action. He came from the Jewish town of Arimathea, and he was waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid it in a rock-hewn tomb where no one had ever been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. And they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment.
What struck me once again as I focused on Luke's version of the trial and crucifixion was how much emphasis is put on Jesus' innocence. Now, that might seem like a strange thing to be struck by after all this time. Of course, Jesus was innocent. We know that. And I think knowing that fact has led me to take that fact for granted. Whereas Luke brings it into focus in some interesting ways. I wonder if any of you can relate to some of these. Let's get the obvious one out of the way. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent. He didn't just have a gut feeling about it either. He interrogated Jesus to find out if he was guilty of anything at all. Not only did Pilate find Jesus innocent, he actively tried to have him released. It's a tragic but very relatable failing in Pilate, I think. He really did try to do the right thing by Jesus. But in the end, the pressure of the crowd was just too much for him. He was, by a margin, the most powerful figure in the whole story, at least in human terms, and yet not strong enough to stand for Jesus when it really counted. History judges him quite harshly for this, but I wonder how many of us could have done better in the same circumstances. How often do we turn from what we know is true in the face of overwhelming social pressure to head the other way? At the other end of the power scale was Barabbas. He knew Jesus was innocent. He knew it because Barabbas himself was charged with violent insurrection. These were the charges the Jewish authorities were trying to make stick to Jesus. Barabbas was in it up to his neck. And yet perhaps the clearest, most overt metaphor for what Christ was setting out to achieve. Barabbas was released, and the punishment for his crimes was enacted on Jesus. The crowds outside Jerusalem knew Jesus was innocent. In a lot of our Lenten meetings this season, we've heard about how Jesus knew what would happen to him the moment he set foot in Jerusalem, the city that murders the prophets, as he described it. Inside the city, the Jewish authorities were able to rile up the crowd and get them crying for blood. But outside the city, the less well-to-do country dwellers, among whom Jesus had been ministering for 3 years, they all knew Jesus was innocent, and they mourned for him as he was led to the place of the skull. There were 2 criminals executed at the same time as Jesus, and they arguably both knew Jesus was innocent. The first one clearly didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. But in his mockery, he shows that he also didn't think Jesus had done anything at all. The second one certainly knew. And he had faith enough to ask for Jesus' compassion, even as they both hung on their crosses. We don't know anything else about this criminal, not even his name. But what amazing faith. Facing agony and certain death, to still place our full faith in God. Jesus recognizes his faith and assures him of eternal life to come. The Roman soldier knew that Jesus was innocent. Maybe not at first, but by the time the sun had turned dark and a mighty earthquake had shook the land, he figured it out. Luke reports him saying, "Truly, this was an innocent man." Matthew reports his words as, "Truly, this was the Son of God." I wonder what it would take to convince the society and culture around us that Jesus is who he said he is. For some, perhaps it would take a miracle. Can we live our lives in such a way that only makes sense if Jesus is who he says he is? Can we become a community characterized by God's self-emptying love so hard that it could only be a miracle? And of course, Jesus' followers, who stood at a distance watching it all unfold, knew he was innocent. They would have been distraught, confused, broken, possibly even feeling disillusioned and let down. They knew Jesus was innocent, but they felt powerless to stop the injustice. The whole world going mad. The only one who's supposed to put it right is the one carrying the weight of the injustice, and they feel completely helpless. They all knew Jesus was innocent. In fact, the only people who thought Jesus was guilty of anything were the Jewish authorities. And they knew he wasn't guilty of violence or insurrection or treason or any of the nonsense charges they threw at him. The charge they really held him guilty of was blasphemy. Blasphemy is one of those words that gets its meaning distorted in common usage. People think of blasphemy as speaking against God or making fun of God or speaking untruths about God. Blasphemy was actually the crime of claiming to be God, of disrespecting God by claiming to be God's equal. So Jesus' claim to be the Son of God is what really got them fired up. Jesus wasn't a threat to the empire. He wasn't even a threat to Herod's little principality, not really. He wasn't interested in an armed uprising against anyone. He wasn't a threat to Rome. But he was a threat to the religious order of the day. An order that placed rules and controls over compassion. An order that valued doctrinal purity over human dignity. An order that sought to build itself up in power and wealth and influence, instead of emptying itself for the sake of the poor and disenfranchised. Jesus wasn't coming in with an armed rebellion. He was simply speaking God's truth. But his claim to speak with God's authority was denounced as blasphemy. From a certain point of view that misses the real point, but a certain point of view, Jesus was guilty of this. He overtly claimed to be the Son of God. We picked up the story in chapter 23 this morning, but at the end of chapter 22, when Jesus is brought before the chief priests, they ask him if he is the Messiah. He straight up tells them he's going to be seated in power at the right hand of God. He's really forcing their hand. Either they believed him or they didn't. I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis's famous paradigm about deciding how to interpret Jesus. Jesus' direct claim to Godhood leaves us without a middle ground to cling to. There's no room to think of Jesus as just a good man without accepting him as the Son of God. He claimed to be God. So either he was or he wasn't. If he wasn't, then either he was a liar, some kind of devil attempting to usurp God's position, or he was a complete lunatic, as Lewis describes it, on the level of a man who believes himself to be a poached egg. Jesus forced the high priests to make a choice. Was Jesus the Son of God, or was it blasphemy? And we are invited to make the same choice. Now, it might seem like a simple and obvious choice around here. Here we are, 8:30 in the morning on a long weekend, sitting in church. So obviously, we believe in Jesus, right? But do our lives and our relationships back that up? When we step out of this building, do the choices we make, the conversations that we have, demonstrate that we are followers of the Son of God? Does our lifestyle align us more with the status quo of our day? Because we really can't have it both ways. Either we acknowledge Jesus' authority as God made incarnate, and everything that this implies, or we deny it as blasphemy. The kingdom of God, as revealed in the teachings of Jesus Christ, calls us to a lifestyle that departs radically from the prevailing culture, where our culture values power and influence and popularity. Jesus teaches others-centered humility, where our society demands that we stand up for our rights. Jesus calls us and shows us how to lay our lives down, to take up a cross and follow him. And when our institutions value fortitude and resilience, Jesus embodies vulnerability and self-emptying. Our culture divides us into a nation of individuals, and Christ calls us on to something bigger, a collective where we all live for the sake of each other. and all of it for the glory of God. We're going to sing one final hymn before I send us out. It's one of the oldest hymns in the book, and I think one of the best. I invite you not just to sing the words by heart, as I'm sure many of you could. They are so familiar. But really pray them deliberately and ask yourself how hard you believe it. Because it's so crucial to who we are. Christ crucified is the foundation on which our entire faith is built. How do we demonstrate to the world around us? By the lives that we live. So let's sing together, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. We have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? As we go from here, as those who bear the title believers, may our lives make the same proclamation that the Roman soldier made. Truly, this was the Son of God. I invite you to go in peace. We will gather again on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. And for those who want to, 7 p.m. for an ecumenical service with some of the other local churches nearby, which will also be held here. But until then, Peace be with you.